We do want to stay with this conversation, and for that, we're joined now by Riley Yesno. She is a lecturer at the University of Toronto. She's also an Indigenous rights advocate. Riley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So after the signing of this memorandum of understanding, BC chiefs responded with a firm, quote, "The answer is still no," and vowed to use every tool to stop the pipeline. That, of course, would be part of this MOU. What's your reaction to the federal government moving forward despite such strong opposition?
My reaction is that I think it affirms what a lot of First Nations and Indigenous people generally have been feeling, which is that the era of so-called reconciliation is over, or is at least significantly changing in Canada. That this is the same government that is supposedly supposed to be implementing an action plan for UNDRIP, which includes, importantly, the article about free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to passing these sorts of projects. And when you sign a memorandum of understanding saying, you know, we are going to be looking for funding to do this, we are going to make it happen, you lose the prior part of free, prior, and informed consent. And so I think that there's a lot of frustration from First Nations, and that we should expect to see pushback both legally and on the ground should this actually materialize into a pipeline project.
And so I want to pick up on what you're saying there. The MOU was signed, of course, as we know, without any BC First Nations at the table, without British Columbia specifically, also the province itself. Now, given, though, that the First Nations hold rights and title to their territories, as you just touched on, what legal protections exist to prevent projects like this pipeline from moving forward without their consent?
So I think that this is where you've seen some really massive, actually, legal court challenges take place, where this would be a violation. I think you could make an argument of Section 35 constitutional rights for Indigenous people, that this would be a violation of UNDRIP, both on the part of the federal government, which again passed UNDRIP in 2021, I believe. And if BC doesn't adequately support them, I think that they could even be brought in because it is a law that's been passed provincially. And so there's some very fundamental documents in Canada that are supposed to lend support in these such instances. And we've seen that these sorts of challenges have resulted in massive economic loss in the past. When you even just look at the TMX pipeline that, saw a lot of opposition, not necessarily in Alberta, but again, in BC, that because of those barriers that First Nations put up in large part, we saw the actual cost of this balloon to 7.5 times what the original estimated cost of the TMX pipeline was. So not only is there, I think, dubious legal basis for this, that I think this means that we should expect that a project would have less economic benefit and be far more costly than what we are being presented with right now.
As part of the remarks we heard from the Prime Minister yesterday, he said that part of this MOU includes, Indigenous ownership, cooperation, economic opportunity as well. And you touched on some of that. And there are some Indigenous voices that come forward saying that they support this sort of a project. Do you think that, because right now there's no specific route that has been outlined for a potential pipeline, there's no outside sort of private sector investor who said they want to take up this project. So do you think that there may be some communities who would welcome this if in fact it falls into a space, their territory?
Absolutely. I'm sure that there would be. Indigenous folks are not monoliths, and they have varying degrees of opinions about things like resource extraction. I think that more and more Indigenous people are also very keen to actually see to be very deliberate about what those material benefits to their First Nations would have to be. For example, I get a red flag when I hear somebody say, it's going to create jobs in Indigenous communities, because history will show us that those jobs, for example, end up often being entry-level, low-paid jobs like cleaning staff or cooking staff, and not actually things that are long-term or pay well and transform the economic prospects of individuals and communities. So those are the types of things that I think even pro-communities would be looking out for in a deal. But also that we see a lot of of cherry picking historically on the part of both provincial and federal governments, is that you'll see them want to work with First Nations who want to, but then completely ignore and underwrite the lack of consent for those who have more strong opposition. And so I think it's important for us when we hear governments say, like, you know, we have First Nations that support this. Are they the right First Nations? Are they all First Nations? And does agreement of some negate the opposition of others? I don't think so. And I think it's something that we need to be more deliberate about talking about.
You know, Riley, you had a chance to listen into the remarks yesterday from Alberta's Premier as well as the Prime Minister, and we didn't get a chance to talk after that. But I'm wondering, as you were listening in to what they were saying following the signing of this MOU, knowing that consultation processes with, for example, BC First Nations communities and the province as well still had to take place for any project to move forward, I'm wondering for you, what you think the future holds for the federal government and Indigenous communities. And you touched on this in your first response.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, I think that the relationship right now is tenser than it has been in certainly, I would say, 5-10 years, that already First Nations have been expressing frustration with this government and their emphasis on a very narrowly conceived definition of what economic reconciliation is, while at the same time passing bills like Bill 5, which are to create, you know, these special economic zones that raised a lot of red flags for First Nations communities. And what I think we're seeing with something like this agreement is that the government is failing in what they were trying to do, which is have their cake and eat it too. They want to promise to be good allies to Indigenous people, to meet all the marks, to do consultation right. And at the same time, they want to do these big business deals with the provinces that require things that are impossible to meet by the standards they've set. So, for example, this Alberta date that they have in April for getting an agreement signed. Consultation, meaningful consultation and agreement takes much, much longer than what they've outlined here. It seems impossible to me to meet. And so we're seeing, again, these two, I think, diametrically opposed values come to head. And it's going to be, I think, rough for the federal government here on out to try and figure out how they are going to hold space for all of these massive promises they make.
Riley, I want to thank you for your thoughts on this today. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was Riley Yesno. She's a lecturer at the University of Toronto and an Indigenous rights advocate. Thanks again.